All right, we're at 9:40, so we can at least start the introductions. Um, Good morning, everyone. This is the Faith and Function class. Today is January 31st, 2021. Our speaker today is Dr. Peter Gathje from Memphis Theological Seminary. This class is being recorded, so it will show up on the Idlewild YouTube channel later on. Before we get into prayer and further introductions, are there any announcements or joys or concerns or prayer requests that we should know about? All right. Uh, in 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 church today, we have a guest speaker, uh, and next week, I guess he starts tomorrow. The new pastor starts, David Powers. So uh, Reverend Powers is younger than I am, so I'm officially no longer a young adult member of the church. But we're good to have him. Maybe we can have him for a good long time. Are there no prayer requests that we know of? Okay. Um, let's go ahead and get started with prayer. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for uh, your word and for the many people who we get to have come speak to us about your word and how it can apply for us in our lives these days, so many centuries later. It still speaks to us, and we thank you for it always. Please forgive us when we sin, both as individuals and collectively. In your son Jesus' name, amen. All right, our speaker today is Dr. Peter Gathje, Vice President and Dean, and I shouldn't be doing this from memory, of Memphis Theological Seminary, on spirituality in the Bible, in the time of pandemic. Thank you. Dr. Gathje, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. One of the nice things about being a person who has spoken with this class many times is that my introduction gets shorter. So, and that's a good thing because then we have more time to talk about what is the real reason why we're here. So, a little bit of review. Last week, introduced the topic of a spirituality in a time of pandemic. And I said that we were going to talk about 4 practices or spiritual disciplines that we may attend to in this time of pandemic. And I put G words for each one of them. So last week we talked about grief and gratitude. And this week our focus will be on graciousness and going forth. So I cheated a little bit by adding a second word after the going. Little bit of review about grief, and a question that kind of occurred to me this week about grief is that we all, I think, at this point have heavy hearts. The death toll from this pandemic is staggering. It's well over 420,000 people just in the United States already. And then there are the people who have had COVID-19 and continue to struggle with significant health issues. There's even a support group out there, several support groups out there on the internet for the so-called long haulers who have had COVID-19 and continue to try to recover from it and may never fully recover. That becomes kind of a chronic illness. This is part of our acknowledgement of what we are in the midst of, and it seems you might say, well, I don't really need that to be a practice. That just comes naturally these days. But what I'm trying to get at with this practice of grieving is to say give grief its due. Sometimes in the Christian life, we're so much encouraged to be people of faith, of hope, of love, and that sometimes gets translated into people who are optimistic and don't pay attention to suffering and death. And that's probably not a very healthy way to live psychologically, but it's also not healthy for our spirituality. Um, One of the things that I find helpful in the life and teachings of Jesus is that Jesus was a person who grieved. He grieved deeply. Might think of the times in which he grieved, as they're preserved in the Gospels, of grieving over the death of his friend Lazarus, grieving over the death of John the Baptist, grieving over the city of Jerusalem, and grieving in anticipation of his own death in the Garden of Gethsemane. So he was not one who avoided grief. Um, and I'm going to go to a gospel hymn that might connect this grieving with being people of faith. This is a gospel hymn by Shirley Caesar. It's called "You Can Make It." And there's a line in this gospel song that says, "When you moan, the devil don't know what you're talking about." And I really like that line. When you moan, the devil don't know what you're talking about, because it connects our moaning with the presence of God in our lives. In other words, our ability to deeply grieve rests in our faith in God, that the way things are is not the way things have to be, that the way things are is not the way things will be. Um, but we come to that honestly through our grief. In the Christian tradition, this has sometimes been talked about as the dark night of the soul, um, as a place in which the very absence of the sense of the absence of God is really the strongest presence of God. And I'll just let that sort of sit out there. We talked a little bit about that last week. Um, we connected that grieving to gratitude, that we come to a greater sense of gratitude, uh, of recognizing what continues to be good in our lives and to savor what is good in our lives, as we take seriously the grief that is in our lives. So that's what we talked about last week. Um, but this week we want to focus on graciousness and going forth. So for graciousness, I'm going to start with a little bit of biblical exegesis. This, I guess, will be in honor of Mitzi Miner, who you had a couple of weeks ago. Um, Tried to do this kind of biblical study by going back and trying to think about or move into what is the biblical understanding of graciousness. And there's a Hebrew word that is chanun or kanun, Chanun. That's the Hebrew word that gets translated as graciousness, uh, as showing favor, showing kindness. Um, and in Hebrew, the kind of the root meaning of this word is providing protection. So we might ask ourselves, where do we go for protection? Where do we go for a sense of safety in our lives? Or to put it in a slightly different way, where do we go to lose our fears? I was just reading this morning uh, about a woman who was caught up in the QAnon conspiracy stuff. And what hooked her into that, and seems to hook a lot of people into these kind of conspiracy theories, is this great sense of uncertainty and fear. One of the things that conspiracy theories offer to people is a sense of certainty, and a sense of I am in on a secret that others don't quite get. And that gives me a kind of sense of security in a very insecure world. I think that's also the appeal for fundamentalism. that in a world of uncertainty, we get absolute answers. It's the appeal of authoritarianism. In a world of uncertainty, we get a leader who will guide us through these uncertain times. Um, it's a temptation, I think, that we have is to try to get that kind of certainty, that absolute rock bottom security in a world that is filled with insecurity and filled with worries and anxiety. And so here it is in the Hebrew Bible, in our Old Testament, this Hebrew word of chanun, of providing protection. Um, so we might think about in our own lives, who are we running to for protection, for solace, for sympathy, for support? Um, I think here of kind of a child running to a parent for protection. Whenever my daughter, who's 5, gets hurt, she's running around, she runs into a door or something and falls on the ground. Um, she always cries out for her mother. She cries out for mommy, and daddy's not sufficient for that kind of loving sense of protection. Kind of irritates me that I'm not the one she yells out for, but that's just the way it is. She recognizes something about that maternal embrace that is reassuring to her that even though she's hurt, she's going to be okay. Of course, when she falls down, sometimes she says, "I'm okay," and she doesn't. She tells us right away that she doesn't need that assurance. So I think about who do we run to for that. We're not 5 years old anymore. Um, Number of us have probably lost our parents, maybe other loved ones that used to be our assurance. Now, who do we run to? Um, what the Hebrew word is getting at is that it's inviting us to consider that God is the one that we run to God for solace, for sympathy, for support. And of course, in that, we're being called to be that for others as well. Made me think of an old hymn that I'm sure you're familiar with, called A Mighty Fortress is Our God. It's a great old hymn. It was written by Martin Luther. It's based on Psalm 46. Um, if we weren't in a COVID time, I would ask the whole class to rise up and sing this song together, because I bet most of you know at least kind of the opening words of this song by heart. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Our helper he amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe does seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not his equal. I mean, he's talking about the power of evil, the power of Satan in our lives. Did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. Were not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing. You ask who that may be. Christ Jesus, it is he. Lord Sabaoth, his name, from age to age the same, and he must win the battle. And as the song then continues in the next 2 verses, it's clear that Luther has run to God for solace, for salvation, for support, and he has experienced that in the presence of God in his life through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Um, that might not be a bad song for us to sing as part of our practice of graciousness. And I think Luther was one of the great theologians of grace, and called the church really to a renewal of reliance upon graciousness. And this sense of God as the rock, as the mighty fortress, as our strength, it permeates the Psalms. If you go into the Psalms, of course, Psalm 46, this song Uh, a mighty fortress is our God. But Psalm 18, verse 2, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my Savior. My God is my rock, in whom I find protection. God is my shield, the power that saves me, and my place of safety. So we experience in the graciousness of God, what the Hebrew word chanun is getting to us or offering to us is a sense of God as our protector, as our rock, as our fortress, as our place that can shield us from the foes that are in our lives, including right now the foe of this pandemic. Um, how do we rest in that graciousness? How do we practice that graciousness? Um, well, I think we might take a moment to, and this is where the chat box might come in handy, to think about answering that question of uh, who do you run to? You wouldn't have to name names, you might name a relationship or a place in your life. Sometimes we run not to a person, but to a place of refuge. Um, where is that in our lives? Where do we find refuge? Do we find it in church? That's hard to do right now because we're not going there physically. Do we find it on a walk? Do we find it in our life partners, in friends? What do people think? Where are you finding this refuge in your lives these days? I invite you to share some of that in chat because this is also how we find refuge with each other as we acknowledge that we are seekers of protection, of solace, of support. And then as you're kind of thinking about that, I'll tease you into, I'm going to tell a story about how this happened in my own life. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how this gets translated into our lives of faith. You know, it's my sisters in God painting. I love that. And artwork and music can be such great places of healing and of solace. There might be another favorite hymn that you have that has provided support for you in your life. And again, I'll connect this. This is our practice of graciousness, of experiencing graciousness in our own lives. Quiet time in my side chair, being quiet. Out of doors, botanic garden. Part of the power of sharing these is that maybe for some of us, we've been seeking a place of refuge and we tried, maybe we can get some suggestions from our friends this morning. Where might we find refuge? So I tell this story of this was a number of years ago, hugging my spouse and my doggies. Hopefully, the spouse and the doggies hug back too. So, yes, they do. Good. Walks at Shelby Farms, watching for wildlife and waiting for hymns and other types of songs to arrive in my head. Love that. So I have a story from my dad. It's hard to believe that this is over 23 years ago. Um, I was in a particularly hard time in my life. Don't know if any of you have gone through a divorce, but it is a particularly hard time. And that's what I was doing. I was going through a divorce. And some of you know that I've been a lifelong Roman Catholic. And in the Roman Catholic Church, especially the church that I was raised in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, divorce was a big no-no. carried a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. And probably does even without the Catholicism, but the Catholicism was just making it worse. And I'd heard my parents speak in kind of quiet tones about a cousin here or an uncle there or an aunt there who had gotten divorced. And it was always, I just picked up from them this sort of sense of this was an awful thing. It was shameful. It's not the way things are ought to be. Well, as I was going through this in my life, I went home for Christmas. Um, and this was all pretty fresh to me. It was really in the early stages of this divorce taking place. And as I got home, it wasn't still go home, and where I was assigned to sleep was always my old bedroom. So I'm sitting on the bed in my old bedroom, and just the weight of everything is just washing over me, and I just start to weep. Uh, that kind of shoulder heaving weeping that is uncontrollable. Um, and as I'm weeping, my room is in the basement, so it's my old room is in the basement. So I thought I was kind of, safe in a way that no one was going to hear me weeping. My dad had come downstairs. His place of refuge in our lives had always been the bathroom downstairs. And I think he had come downstairs to use the bathroom, and he must have heard me. He came into the room and just sat down next to me. He didn't say a word and just put his arms around me and held me as I wept. You need to know that I had been raised in a Germanic, Midwestern family in which hugs were not commonplace, and especially from my dad. And as I sat there, I couldn't hardly believe that my dad was hugging me. I was 40 years old. Um, he hadn't probably hugged me in 20 years. And again, he didn't say anything. He just held me until my weeping subsided. And then he said, "It's going to be okay. We love you," which was also to hear my dad say anything about love was just unheard of. Um, that was for me a kind of turning point in my own life of the sense of, yes, I'm going to carry this kind of woundedness with me, in the kind of the grieving inside of me, and it still wells up from time to time. Um, but it is going to be okay, and I carry that memory very fondly of my dad, who died some 8 years ago now, but is one of the most powerful uh, stories in my life. And I think, this is where or how God is in our lives, that God embraces us uh, if we weep in the presence of God. Let ourselves weep in the presence of God. There's a there's some great stories in the Bible about God's embrace of us, and I'm going to share one that we may not think of this so much as God's embrace, but it's the story of Exodus. Um, there's a wonderful sort of repetitiveness in this story. 7 times Moses goes to the Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." And it's not just "let my people go," but each time, each of those 7 times, Moses says, "Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me," that is to God, in the wilderness. And this, of course, is establishing a practice of Sabbath, the rest from labor, from slavery, um, when another is determining our lives, when we have no rest, where we'd have no place of refuge. Um, Moses is saying, God is calling us forth. Let my people go that they may have a time of Sabbath, that they may experience the loving arms of God around them. And that's um, where we might think about as we think about a practice of graciousness in our lives, is whether or not we're allowing ourselves to have Sabbath. If we're allowing ourselves to have those times where we hug our spouse and our doggies, we go outdoors to the botanic garden, that we sit quietly in a side chair, when we paint, when we talk with our sisters, maybe our brothers too, when we take our walks in Shelby Farms. I have to say, one of the greatest gifts of the pandemic for me is that I have returned to a regular practice of going for a morning walk. And so I leave the house at about 6:15, and it's still dark. And by the time now, by the time I've got to the halfway point and I'm turning towards home, the sun is coming up. Of course, some days I don't get to see the sun because it's cloudy. But on those days where I get to experience the beauty of the sunrise, um, I'm taken aback by the kind of sense of the embrace of God that I get from that light coming into the darkness. As I walk, it is getting lighter and lighter, and it's almost like it's preparing me for the day that God is going to sustain me in the light for the day. This is so important for us to have these places of refuge, to have this sense of God's protection, God's loving arms around us. If we're going to not live in fear and therefore not be susceptible to the fear mongers who want us to be fearful and want us to be suspicious, want us to be cynical, um, but also for us to be able to then be gracious with others in our own lives, and so that we can offer that sense of protection, that sense of welcome, that embrace of others that people are seeking in our own lives. So there's this kind of give and take in this practice of graciousness. And the take is what I've been emphasizing mostly, which is a reception, is probably a better word, to have the time and the space in our lives in which we can receive that protectiveness of God, in which we can sing "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," to rest in the power of God's love in our lives. Um, if we return to that hymn, and though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. And if that's the kind of the working out of the graciousness of God in our lives, that deep sense of rootedness, of security, of welcome that we have in our lives, then we're able to share that uh, with others. Um, if we're gentle with ourselves, if we accept the gentleness of God in our own lives, then we can in turn and be gentle with others. So that's graciousness. Um, and we'll come back and have some time for discussion about that in a bit. But let me talk about our fourth G, going forth. And I'm kind of been laying the groundwork for that already. I want to emphasize that going forth is not a practice that we should engage in unless we continue to keep engaging in grieving and gratitude um, and graciousness. I know I have a tendency, I want to run and do things. um, I want to solve problems. And what I need to be careful of is that I can do problem solving as a way to avoid uh, my own kind of grief work that I need to be doing in my own life, and I can be avoiding accepting of God's graciousness as I go forth. So, just want to emphasize that this is a step that is grounded in the continual practice of the other three practices that we've talked about. And this really is going forth is to, first of all, go forth and attend to the grief of others from our own sense of grief, that we can be in solidarity with the grief of others because we're not avoiding our own grief. We've attended to our own grief. Henry Nouwen calls this being wounded healers, which I think is a great phrase. Um, I'm going to quote somebody named James McLaughlin said, "What each of us needs from the other is at depth pretty much the same. We need to find in the other an affirming witness to the best that we hope we are, as well as an accepting and durable respondent to those worse aspects of ourselves that we fear we are." And we can only be that kind of presence, I think, if we're aware of our own failures, aware of also our own grievings, aware of our own woundedness. That is what we need to attend to if we're going to be good partners with others in their woundedness. This is what I call a kind of a ministry of presence. We're not offering solutions. We're just being with the person on their journey. I find this really a difficult thing sometimes for a white male like myself to do. Um, my wife will come to me sometimes to share some sorrow in her life or some challenge that she's facing, and I have to resist the temptation to solve the problem for her. This is the sort of a when I can become a know-it-all, and what I need to be is not a know-it-all, but a listen to it all. And that's a key, I think, in our relationships with each other is to be good listeners, to be empathetic and sympathetic rather than to be problem solvers. Now, if somebody asks us to maybe offer advice, maybe that time at that point we can offer some, but we should be cautious even with that. I teach students Manna House is a site for the clinical practicum students who are studying to be pastors, and this is um, this is the hardest thing for students to learn, that in pastoral situations, um, they're not really there to solve the problems of others. They're there to listen, and that is really more possible, I think, if we have already been listened to, if we have already listened to ourselves and accepted the grief that's in our own hearts, and recognizing that grief is not really addressed very well by somebody saying to us, "Oh, you'll be fine. Just get over it." That's not very helpful. But what is helpful in our lives of grief, I think, is somebody coming like my dad did and just putting his arm around me and just being with me. That's the kind of going forth to grieve with others. We also go forth to celebrate with others, to celebrate the gifts that are in our lives, um, that we name gifts with each other. We name the ways in which we continue to be gifted in our lives. This is certainly part of Sabbath, part of worship, as we are thankful in our life of worship. We also go forth to be gracious with others. Um, we go forth to simply be co-conspirators. This is what kind of how graciousness can work out. um, to breathe with others. Uh, this is one of the interesting things to me is how COVID-19, which takes our breath away, coincided with the events of last summer where the police officer was standing on the neck of George Floyd in the Twin Cities and he couldn't breathe. Um, there's a spiritual connection, I think, where we're recognizing the importance of breath, both in our communal or societal life and in our personal lives. In graciousness, we are breathing with each other and we're seeking to support the breathing of others. Um, this is kind of a practice within meditation of attending to our breath, to breathe in God and to breathe out all that we're sorrowing over, all that we're grieving over. As we attend to our breath, and we can breathe in and breathe out um, various aspects of our lives. But if you think about it, if you sit quietly and breathe in deeply, the love of God, the graciousness of God, the goodness of life, and we breathe out, we send forth what we do not want to hold on to, that we need to let go of. And that's a practice of meditation that can be a practice of graciousness. That's what I mean by being co conspirators, co breathers with each other. Julie Poultier, in a book called Reviving Our Common Life in a World Struggling to Breathe, writes, "We breathe together in ways seen and unseen. And though that makes us vulnerable, it also gives us common life. Without our God given life spirit, holy breath filling both our lungs and our souls, we are dry bones." So we breathe in that spirit of God and we breathe out what we need to let go of. And that's what we're sharing in graciousness with others. Part of this is also recognizing that um, this sort of desire for us sometimes gets expressed. I just want to get back to the normal that I had before. Why can't things just get back to normal? Part of this is to help us to see that the normal wasn't that great. That there are ways in which we need to dream into existence a new normal. So it's not just going back, rather, we need to look forward and to say, uh, if we're wise, we won't go back. We'll go forward. But we can only go forward in a way that's helpful if we've attended to the grief and the gratitude and the graciousness. So there's this great book that Dr. King wrote, which is Where Do We Go From Here? Um, and I think this is what we have to wrestle with. Where do we go from here? We don't know the future. We're not exactly sure what things are going to look like post pandemic. Um, we do know that things aren't going to be the same, but we need to attend to how do we create a future that is better rather than simply uh, trying to seek the past, trying to redo what we had in the past. So these are our practices. Um, our practice of grieving. We mourn what we have lost and what others have lost. We practice gratitude. We recognize the gifts that are still in our lives and we give thanks for those gifts. We practice graciousness as we are gentle with ourselves and we seek refuge in a time of Sabbath, in a time of allowing God's embrace to be done around us and around others. And then we are called to go forth, to be informed by our grief so that we can be compassionate, to be informed by our gratitude so that we can be thankful, to be informed by graciousness so that we can be gentle and loving and people of refuge for others. And all of these, we're acknowledging how we have received these things from God. So I want to end with a hymn, another hymn. So this is a morning of 3 hymns. This is our last one, another great old hymn, which is "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah." Um, and what I like to do with hymns is not sing them sometimes, but to read them. It kind of slows us down a little bit and changes what they do. And then I'll go back and sing it later. But guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Feed me till I want no more. Open now the crystal fountain, whence the healing stream doth flow. Let the fire and cloudy pillar lead me all my journey through. Strong deliverer, be thou still my strength and shield. Be thou still my strength and shield. And of course, that's just the first verse. So there's more to come. I'd recommend meditatively going through that song as a kind of a practice of how we experience all 4 of these G's in our lives. And so with that, we're at about 10:22. There's time for some discussion, and I think you can perhaps unmute yourself, or if you want, you can use the chat feature. Either way is fine by me. Anything that you found helpful or that you have questions about, or
We're gonna
offer some commentary.
we're gonna sing "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah" in about an hour.
Great.
It's it's the opening hymn in worship this morning.
Yeah, that's Calvin would call that providential.
I don't know that we're gonna sing "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" until the last week in October.
Right. Reformation
But
Sunday.
yeah,
That's
they
when
have to
they
remind us that we're still Protestant.
Yeah. So I knew Vatican II had brought great change when we sang "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" in a Catholic church. Other comments or questions? Was this helpful? Did you get anything out of it that you might walk away with and say, okay, I can do that, or
Holding
I can be
hold,
that? Yes,
hold,
go ahead.
recognizing grief and holding on to it to make you compassionate. Thank you. That's
Mhm.
going to help me.
Thank you. That's something that I'm really grateful for, the grief in my life that has taught me compassion, and also undercut a great deal of self-righteousness in my life. I think suffering, going through a divorce was a very helpful thing. I wouldn't wish it upon anybody. But there comes a kind of existential choice in our lives when we encounter deep suffering. We can either try to run from it and deny it and try to be ever more controlling in our lives, or we can allow it to soften us and help us to recognize that other people are suffering too, and that other people are suffering loss. And in fact, everybody suffers loss. One of the things I've wrestled with kind of in a funny way is I've been trying to figure out what is the deep grief or sorrow in the life of Donald Trump, because he so seeks to run from grief. There must be some deep sorrow in his life that he just hasn't been able to address, and I think that's probably true of lots of folks who are so insistent upon being in control, in charge, never admitting any weakness, that I think they're running from a deep grief. And so I pray for him. My prayer for Donald Trump is that someday he may acknowledge the grief that's in his own heart, because that's where love blossoms forth, where we become compassionate.
I wanted to say that I'm grateful for this pandemic, oddly enough, because I've been troubled by the fact that when you look at the media, I just get this strong sense that we have all of these devices and all this entertainment, and to serve so much distraction, the person has no time. They probably don't want any more time, but they'll have their television on, all day and all night, and they'll be on the internet. It just seems endless, and nothing's really taking any traction with them. So the pandemic has really forced us to slow down. I don't find the spike in suicides surprising at all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see, and divorce rates probably, and domestic violence, unfortunately. But people many people have had to come to grips with who they are and where they are in this world, and I'm no exception to that.
Thank you. Yes, I'm grateful for similar reasons. I'm thinking of, I've been reading this long biography of Frederick Douglass, like over 800 pages. And one of the things that strikes me, not as getting I'm almost done, but Frederick Douglass had this deep grief in his life, especially towards the end of his life. I mean, there was a 2-month period in which he lost 5 of his grandchildren to death. And I'm thinking, and that was not unusual in the 1800s, right? That this was a typhoid fever is what apparently took all of these children. And I think there was a kind of sorrow that people carried in their lives, and they didn't have any way to distract themselves from it. And I think that one of the reasons we're struggling so much in our own society is that we do distract ourselves from our grief, from our sorrow, and it hardens us, because it keeps us at this kind of superficial level that doesn't allow us to be compassionate with ourselves, much less with others. And I think that explains a lot of the violence in our society, and the kind of the way in which our politics have become about simply power rather than seeking the well-being of all of us. And I think that's true of both political parties, in different ways. And I'm not saying that they're equal or sort of any of that, but there is this sense, I think, at the highest levels of political power that it's really more just about keeping power than it is about trying to do something for the well-being of everybody, whether they're Republican or Democrat or whatever.
Well, I really appreciate what you said about fundamentalism, and that people, all they want is answers. They don't want to have to question anything. The idea of trying to deal with this mystery that we all in this group probably enjoy or look forward to, and actually gain strength from the fact that we don't know. And all these people that you see joining these far right groups, and anybody who is just looking for an answer, it just shows something is so huge is missing in their life. I mean, the vacuum must be enormous.
Yeah, and I think this is where we have a call to ministry on our parts, is how do we be graciousness in the midst of that? How do we, offer a listening ear? This is one of the books that I find so fascinating is it's by Will Campbell, a good old Baptist minister who was active in the civil rights movement and way beyond. But he wrote a book called A Brother to a Dragonfly, in which he, as a civil rights activist, became the pastor of a Klansman. And I think that's beyond my capacity, I think. Though that's part of what I'm praying for, and for my own conversion, is how can I be welcoming to those who are my enemies, and not simply my enemies, but who are danger to others. Because part of what draws people out of something like fundamentalism or the QAnon stuff is not more facts or rational argument. What draws people out is more powerful relationships. And that's, I think that's what we have to offer as we're deeply formed in God's love, is our ability to be welcoming to others. That's the great challenge of our lives, I think. It's not easy.
By the way, I think you should recommend that book to everybody. Billy Vaughn put me onto it, and I thank him often.
Yeah, it's a great book. Will Campbell's just fun to read all the time. I mean, I shouldn't say fun, but powerfully helpful to read. I'd tell you a story about Will Campbell. This is kind of gets to this empathy and moving into the life of another in order to speak powerfully. He was at a anti-death penalty seminar. There are series of public speaking events, and it was one of those places where that it was at a university, so they of course had invited anti-death penalty people and had invited pro-death penalty people, and they were supposed to have this great debate. So the pro-death penalty person gets up and gives this long talk, laying out the whole long case for the death penalty and why it's righteous and just. And so when he's done, Will Campbell gets up and he says, I just don't have a lot to say except that the death penalty is just tacky. And he sat down. It's just tacky. Which is a great old Southern word, right? And it's powerful, right? It just cuts through the bullshit and it's tacky.
We're I haven't heard that word in a long time.
Yeah.
My mother used to use it.
Yeah.
Oh.
And of course, the response of the audience, of course, was just like your response, was laughter, right? I mean, and it cut through sort of all the defenses, the emotional and intellectual defenses that we build up, and just that zing right into it. That's at the heart of the matter, and it's revelatory when people can do that in our lives, or we can do it in the lives of others. But that only comes out of Will Campbell being able to do that comes out of a lifetime of prayer and of activism and of commitment to the well-being of everybody, including the people that he disagrees with. That's hard. That's a discipline. It's a spiritual disciplines. Well, thanks, everybody. I think we're near the end of our time. Maybe one more question or comment. I'm not sure, Daniel, what the time frame is.
Pete, I want to thank you for your comments about going forth, because I think it's so easy for us to be still dealing and wallowing in the grief that we haven't been looking forward to what things are going to be and can be. And I think it's very cathartic to do that. And I hope whatever level we are, our individual lives, our family, our churches, our schools, whatever, that we embrace that and start thinking about it now and not wait until it's over, because then it'd be too late. And it would be, in the meantime, a great way to deal with the grief, I think.
Yeah, and I think if we carry our grief into our thinking forward, and that's the trick, right? That's what our grief and our gratitude and the graciousness, we carry that into our going forth. So the lessons that we've learned along the way stick with us. Lessons of compassion, of slowing down, of attending to the well-being of others. Those, how can we let those shape our future? I think that's what our challenge will be going forth. Well, thanks everybody. One thing I do look forward to is returning to being with people in a room, having conversation. Zoom's okay, but it's not as good as being in the same room and being able to interact with people as embodied children of God rather than disembodied spirits. Which is not even disembodied spirits, digitalized spirits.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Pete.
Thank you.
Yep.
Enjoy singing today.
Thanks, everybody. See you guys next week.
Bye-bye.